It's called a special relationship, an unbreakable bond. That is how the alliance between the UK and the US has been described. And this could not hold truer when it comes to the Iran nuclear deal, when the UK Prime Minister announced how the JCPOA should be replaced with the Trump deal. In this edition of the debate, we will look at this special relationship, how the UK has bowed to US interests, and whether this alliance has been brought by the US literally.
Iran categorically rejects the British Prime Minister's proposal to replace the 2015 nuclear agreement with a, quote, Trump deal.
If you take a wrong step, you will suffer losses. Choose the right path. The right path is that you return to the JCPOA. The British Prime Minister, I don't know what he thinks. He says let's discard the JCPOA and implement the Trump deal instead. Trump has done nothing but violate international law.
Hassan Rouhani made the comments a day after Britain, France and Germany triggered a dispute resolution mechanism in the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action after accusing Iran of violating the deal. The mechanism could lead to reimposition of the UN sanctions which had been removed following the 2015 deal. The Europeans' move comes after Iran's phased reduction of commitments in response to Europe's failure to live up to its nuclear commitments.
The nuclear deal, the JCPOA was written with full knowledge of the fact that it might be violated by various parties. That is why we put in mechanisms in order to make sure that if one party or several parties violated the deal, we could take measures in order to keep it alive. Iran took those measures some time ago in May of 2018, and those measures are working. Now the Europeans have decided, in order to hide their inability to perform, to take those measures. I don't think they have any standing in JCPOA to do that.
Russia has slammed the EU's decision to trigger the mechanism as a new escalation. The move has also drawn criticism from Beijing.
China regrets about Britain, France and Germany triggering the dispute resolution mechanism in the Iran nuclear deal. It is neither of any help to settle the problems nor ease the current tense situation. China always believes that Iran has its reasons for reducing its commitments in the JCPOA. The United States unilaterally withdrew from the deal, ignores international law and international obligations, exerts extreme pressure on Iran, and obstructs other parties from fulfilling their obligations. This is the root cause of the tense situation on Iran nuclear issue.
The European parties to the JCPOA have repeatedly announced that they seek to preserve the deal despite the US withdrawal from the accord in late 2018. However, the British Premier's recent comments about a so-called Trump deal have raised serious questions about the ability and intentions of the Europeans, particularly London, to resist US unilateralism. Such concerns have been fueled by the UK government's defense of Washington's anti-Iran policies, including the assassination of top Iranian commander Qasem Soleimani in Iraq.
Our guest joining us for this edition of the debate, we have Ian Williams. He's a senior analyst at Foreign Policy in Focus. We also have Jim Dean, managing editor at Veterans Today. Gentlemen, welcome. Jim Dean, let me first start with you. It has been called a special relationship, this US-UK alliance. It's been repeated a lot. Give us a history check on this, if you can, as to why this has been deemed as such.
Well, we have the past wars, particularly World War I, World War II, which are really anchors in the relationship, where the U.S. Americans came overseas to bail Britain out of dumb European wars, kind of similar to what's been going on currently in Syria and the controversy with Iran. But this story with Britain now is even more bizarre because we had the foreign minister just a day or two ago said that the U.S. that they're going to have to recalibrate depending on the special relationship with the U.S. Because they've abrogated their responsibility for quote-unquote world leadership. And they may have to be looking more toward Europe. And of course, the bizarre number two is here's Britain leaving the EU under Brexit. They have some tough negotiations ahead. So it seems that the British foreign policy is an understatement to say it's a little bit disarray, and you have to take almost anything coming out of there now as having any long-term strategic planning to it, but somebody just trying to grab the headlines and trying to make it look like they're in control and they're formulating some kind of policy. And this is the devolution of Western political behavior that we've seen over the last 5 years now.
Okay, well, if we want to check at the root of this, Ian Williams, it seems, based on what we're saying, and it has happened time and again, that the UK is following the US dictation on this. Does this stem from this Five Eyes that has been cited to be this intelligence alliance that is formed between 5 countries, in which it's a multilateral UK-US agreement in terms of the treaty for joint cooperation? Does this stem from that?
Well, this is the most tangible part of it, where Britain does have some minimal leverage. We have to remember, during World War II, Britain gave the shop to America. It basically sold out its empire, it sold its resources at fire sale prices, it built up huge debts which were only paid off 10 years ago. So it's always been a very unequal alliance. It's a very special relationship in that sense. But you have to remember that during the Vietnam War, for example, Labour Prime Minister Harold Wilson resisted ferocious pressure from LBJ to get Britain involved. Britain realized that domestically it could not get involved in Vietnam without huge repercussions. And I hope that's a possible model here. Any war or conflict in the Middle East is immensely unpopular in Britain, even with Boris Johnson. But Boris Johnson has that dilemma that although Britain doesn't face an existential threat from the Warsaw Pact anymore or from Nazi Germany, it is just launched out into the ocean on its own, abandoning the security of a trade and political alliance with Europe. So he's very dependent on the US. But this is a very sort of fleeting and insecure relationship. Donald Trump has shown that he's quite prepared to stomp on allies and allies if it suits him. He stomped on everybody except Israel so far in terms of trade and other political concomitants. So to that extent, Boris Johnson is hogtied. But in this one, it's extremely unpopular that he should do this. And the other parties in Europe should be ashamed of themselves. They have failed to fulfill their part of the JCPOA. They should be rounding upon Donald Trump for pulling out of it rather than rounding upon Iran. They should be providing mechanisms to make sure that the unjustified and now sort of un-UN sanctions on Iran are negated, but they haven't. Instead, they're kicking the weaker party in this, which is Iran. Now, the implications are sort of very obscure, because in the past, the US used a sort of default mechanism to ensure some very tiny fig leaf of cover for its war on Iraq at the time. It declared all of the UN sanctions from previous days still standing unless there was a positive vote to remove them. And it's built a deal like that into the JCPOA trigger mechanism now. But it's a very dubious legal gambit, because the US is now no longer a party of the JCPOA. It withdrew. So it doesn't have the standing to invoke it, from one way of looking at it. If the Europeans go to the European Union, go to the United Nations Security Council and report that Iran has failed, it first of all has to justify the fact that Iran has failed to fulfill it, and secondly to justify the fact that if Iran did in any way default on the obligations, it was in response to a much bigger default by the United States. And so they might get some authorization from a very legal point, but I think what happened at the end of the Iraq war was people stopped following American advice about what the UN sanctions on Iraq were. They traded with Iraq anyway. And I think that's going to happen here. These sanctions will not have any ethical or moral justification. And most countries will ignore them as far as they can, regardless of what the particular legal reckoning that they produce to say that this clause is triggered by default. Because it's quite clear they could not get a positive vote in the Security Council to reimpose sanctions on Iran now. So they have to rely upon these from many years ago, which were very dubiously acquired even then. If you remember, the original sanctions were brought in and the original reference because India, having just conducted a nuclear test, was told that the Americans would allow it to trade in defiance of American and international law if it voted for the IAEA referral to the Security Council.
Right.
So the whole apparatus becomes pretty much immoral, unethical, and politically unsustainable. That's the real point. They're devaluing the United Nations, they're devaluing international disarmament provisions by this type of legal finagling.
Okay. Let's examine this European dispute resolution, Jim Dean. But before I ask you this question, this came just hot off the press, literally, with Reuters reporting that Trump administration threatened to put tariffs on European automobile imports if European countries did not accuse Iran of breaking the 2015 nuclear deal. What's your reaction when you hear this? Again, this is breaking news coming through right now.
Well, it's certainly not a surprise. Trump is kind of desperate here to make it look like he's in control, particularly after the devastating response from Iran, very limited, very measured, that they just executed in Iraq that has the U.S. reeling. Trump has politically been hurt, and including his whole administration. Pompeo has been subpoenaed with the House to be brought in. They're going to be questioning him that the cooked, faked intelligence was used to justify this imminent threat now, which I can tell you unequivocally that most intelligence people know damn well that it probably was cooked intelligence. We've seen it many times before, and this was kind of an amateurish one that they pulled. But so now he's trying to do what he usually does, make some spin, get the focus onto another issue. He is, one thing I'll give him credit for, he's a master at grabbing the microphone and getting people's attention off something he doesn't want discussed and on to something new. Mm-hmm. But Iran has been through this many times before. They're ready for it. And he's going to put the squeeze on the Europeans because he still had them dangling on their sanctions. Nothing's been really resolved there. Mm-hmm. The key part of this, I think, now is they're trying to get the story off what happened with Iran being able to defend itself, doing a very measured attack, defeating the U.S. air defenses, and showing that it has precision-guided missiles and is able to defend itself from any attack from outside parties. Okay. And that's really the big story that's happened in the last 30 days. And they're desperate to get that story off the front page.
Well, the reason I mentioned this breaking news, Ian Williams, is I'm wondering if the Trump administration is using this type of tactic, since our focus is the U.S.-UK relationship, to put pressure on the UK. Because, for example, since we're talking about Iran, I don't want this program to be all about Iran, by the way, but since we're talking about Iran, the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson coming out saying, first, yes, let's salvage the 2015 the nuclear deal, the JCPOA. He has said that time and again, even up till yesterday, until he says, well, let's save it by replacing the old deal with a Trump deal. So, you know, when he says that, Ian Williams, what does that show? Is this a reflection of the special relationship, or is the Trump administration, Trump in particular, putting pressure on the UK, like this breaking news that I mentioned here about putting tariffs on European auto imports?
Well, this has all the klutziness and diplomatic ineptitude we've come to expect of Trump and to some extent of Boris Johnson. I hope I'm not wrong, no European government can now support the reimposition of sanctions on Iran under the threat of a tariff war from America, because it would show that they don't believe it's justified in its own right, that they're doing it because of blunt bullying by Trump. I mean, it would be politically unacceptable to try, especially if this looks like it's heading for war conditions, which it does in some ways. So the political ineptitude of Trump has really blown the bottom of the boat out. For Boris as well, because Boris now wants a Trump deal. He wants a Trump deal. What does Trump want? Trump does not want the Iranian regime to survive. That's the top and bottom. He's made that very plain. He doesn't want any type of agreement. He wants a perennial cold or hot war with Iran. He's going to pull back from the hot war because it looks like it's going to be a lot more costly after the missile attacks. Even the Israelis are saying, whoops, we didn't really mean it, because it might put us in the front line. Not us, not us. So it really puts him in an impossible position. He's been posturing, he's been swinging from the ropes and the trees, beating his chest. What can he do now? He cannot really deliver. If the Europeans succumb to this type of American pressure, they will come under tremendous pressure from their own publics, because it denigrates everything that they've been saying, that they are the best friends, that they're the interlocutors. So you're going to go with a friend who is threatening to beat you up if you don't vote the way he wants? What type of friend is this? We know what type of friend it is. Most European voters will as well. I think any government that agrees to this will pay a heavy political price.
Okay. Looking at the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, Jim Dean, you had this attack take place, an assassination of this lieutenant general, and we saw the aftermath of that. But the aftermath that was not highlighted in particular was how the UK reacted to it. First, it said that it was uninformed. It did not react positively to the fact that it was not told by the U.S. it's going to do this. And then news came out how the UK is actually maybe abandoning its alliance with Trump because of this assassination. It kind of turns out that's not the case. However, the UK has said, the Defense Secretary Ben Wallace, that it's looking to forge stronger alliances with other international partners. So the UK Defense Secretary showing how this alliance may be somewhat rocky if the U.S. is going to conduct this type of behavior. Is this just hitting the rocks here, but then making up? Or is the UK actually thinking of forging ahead without the U.S. when it comes to military cooperation, for example?
I think it shows symptoms of floundering around. And listening to you repeat those statements, the first thing that came to my head is the UK foreign minister and defense minister. They're kind of like playing Trump. You say one thing one day, and then the next day you wake up and you say something that's in conflict with it, and try to stand there and pretend that the public shouldn't notice that for some reason. That the two positions don't really gel with each other. So again, I see they're trying to outdo Trump. He said, "Well, we're gonna." He's been so successful at this. You just never know what he says, whether it's true or not. The way to keep the enemy off balance, does he really mean that? Or is he just faking it? It almost looks like they said, we're going to get in on this too and get everybody confused. And therefore, we're a moving target and hard for people to respond to. So more of a, the classic thing that VT's been editorializing about for years, that this is typical geopolitical chaos theory, which Israel says it's been the master of the science. And once you create chaos in the world or in regions, you can then go in and take advantage of that in a number of ways, militarily, politically, and intelligence-wise, to your benefit. So it's always easier to launch offensive operations, so again, political, espionage, and whatever, when there's chaos in the region, and they're stirring the pot now. And the JCPOA breakdown is part of that design. To not have anything in place, and then they can paint, as Israel's already said, Iran's going for the bomb. They're going to have it in a few months now if we don't stop them. And of course, Israel can't do anything about that whatsoever now.
Okay. I'm looking at some of the statements here in Williams that the UK Defense Secretary made, and it goes back. I kind of answered my own question when I asked if does the U.S. use threat tactics. It says here, the UK Defense Secretary, that aside from the fact that the U.S. risks withdrawing from its leadership role, as he says, around the world, he said that Trump threatened to tear up its intelligence sharing relationship with the U.K. This comes after the assassination of Qasem Soleimani. So what is this intelligence sharing relationship that is so important, which begs the question, is the U.K., without the U.S. military cooperation and intelligence cooperation, not able to do it on its own, that the U.S. therefore holds that much power over it?
Well, the UK doesn't have that in global scope anymore. It does have a vestigial global scope because of a hangover of empire. It has bases, tracking facilities, spotting facilities all over the world in former colonies. And also, we have to remember, there's a political aspect here, is the UK facilities are allowed to spy on US domestic telephone calls and things like that. It was the UK that spied on the United Nations and Kofi Annan on behalf of the Americans, because the American law stopped the Americans doing it themselves. It's a small item, but it's quite a big one in terms of intelligence. The Pentagon intelligence and the DEA, all of the other people who deal with this, would be appalled if Britain and the Five Eyes were wiped out because of Trump's tantrums. But also, we have to remember in Britain, in a US cabinet minister is an appointee. He's a complete minion and creature of the president, as we've seen, as he goes through them. He chucks them out like ice lolly wrappers. But in Britain, okay, they have to pay a lot of attention to Boris Johnson. He's the prime minister. But these ministers are independent politicians in their own right. And they can walk. Incidentally, the foreign ministry in Britain is, I'm not always on the side of it by any means, but it's sophisticated, it knows the area, it has a lot of experience, and it has a lot of power in the British establishment.
Okay, I'm going to unfortunately jump in, Ian Williams, to ask my last question since we're running out of time. I do apologize for that, Ian Williams. But Jim Dean, last question, under a minute. This piece of report really was an eye-opener, how Boris Johnson and 3 of his ministers are being courted by a U.S. institute, AEI, pushing for war with Iran. That money has been paid to the British Prime Minister, £70,000, and 3 of his closest allies. What do you think? Under a minute.
Well, again, they're stirring the pot, and Trump is looking for a big ally here, at least one that he claimed. As you know, where the impeachment trial is starting next week, and a lot of this we were expecting. What is he going to pull out of his hat to get the public's eye off of what's going to be going on in Congress? Something that we haven't seen, and for which his political power did a big dent on it before the end of January.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Jim Dean, Managing Editor at Veterans Today. Ian Williams, thank you so much, Senior Analyst at Foreign Policy in Focus. Thanks for tuning in to another edition of The Debate. From me, Goodbye. Until next time.